But there's one last title that we have to talk about today, which is a title that is a UE5 title. It's a good-looking UE5 title as well, but critically, it's not using some of these headlining UE5 features on any platform. It's kind of using more of a feature set akin with a lot of UE4 titles, I would say. And that game is Split Fiction. But Split Fiction is notable in some respects in the kinds of concessions that it's still making on Switch 2, despite notionally having a feature set that should be pretty well suited to the hardware. It's actually not running necessarily as well as we might expect or want out of the Switch 2 hardware. Isn't that true, Alex?
Yeah, basically, well, the first thing when you put these two side to side, Series S versus the Switch 2 here, I actually think they're visually quite similar to one another in many ways. Less large differences or smaller differences than we had seen with the previous two titles we talked about, at least from a visual perspective. But the most thing you notice right away is just the refresh rate and frame rate. It's 30 FPS. Like it was immediately apparent to me, oh, this is a 30 FPS game. And that definitely has some knock-on effects that I think we'll have to talk about. But in general, a lot of the rest of the presentation was quite similar, even in terms of resolutions here. I believe they're both targeting, I don't think it's TSR, but a TAAU presentation maxing out at 1080p.
Yep.
And there are some differences, though, there in terms of image quality that do show up. For example, hair in cutscenes is noticeably more aliased than it is on Series S on the Switch 2 version. And it's hard to actually chalk that up to something without further investigation, but that is just immediately a visual difference. Another thing you'll see in cutscenes is also things like depth of field have been stripped out of the Switch 2 version. And that does give the game at times I would say, crisper resolve when you're in cutscenes. Like if you were just not paying attention, you'd be like, oh, this is higher res on Switch 2. It isn't, of course. It's just there's no depth of field at all being applied to the image. Other things, when you look at them, like you're still getting SSR, screen space reflections there on the Switch 2 version. They are sometimes a bit laggy and ghosty, but they're there. Just as much as they are actually on the Series S. You still get some occasional ambient occlusion. Shadow maps, though, appear to be lower res than we see in the Series S version. In the few areas that do use real-time cascaded shadow maps, it's actually not across the entire game. They kind of mix techniques here. Some static versions of the shadows are in the game, too. And in general, though, if you ignore the frame rate and ignore those other nips and tucks I just talked about, it actually compares pretty well to the Series S version. I was a little bit surprised, regardless of everything, that even for what is ostensibly of an Unreal Engine 4 title from a visual perspective, and it's already using things to improve performance a lot, but like baked lighting and baked shadows, I was still surprised to see that they had to turn down things like shadow map resolution, where usually shadow map resolution after a certain point is not a function of how much compute you have available, but it's somewhat a function of how much memory you have available. And we know actually that Switch 2 has more memory available to games, I think, than we have on Series S. So I was surprised to see that cut back in there, and I wonder actually how completely necessary it is. But at least at the 30 FPS that was there, it was pretty consistent. There were a handful of drops occasionally, but yeah, a fine title overall on Switch 2, but it was just strange to see that it had any sort of reductions against that Series S version.
Yeah, to me, the disappointment here really comes from the fact that, we know Switch 2 has DLSS, right? And we know from prior games being ported to Switch 2 that oftentimes, developers who are looking over their work with maybe a fresh set of eyes, have some new tools available to them. Hopefully, they can kind of leverage some of these efficiencies in Switch 2 to deliver a more comparable version of their game than you would expect based on the specs. But here it's kind of just scaling in that kind of more linear way, where Switch 2 in docked mode is maybe half a Series S, give or take. And so Switch 2 in docked mode is half a Series S, give or take. They're still using the same TAA. They're not using some of those more exotic features on Switch 2 to deliver a faster refresh, to deliver a more satisfying gameplay experience, which is kind of a shame. because we do see that from other developers. Obviously, Star Wars Outlaws would be the number one example here. I think on Switch 2, our kind of number one port, the best port that we've seen on Switch 2 so far. Most impressive, aligns closely with the Series S version in a lot of respects that are very highly impressive. We're not seeing that here, and I think it's kind of interesting because in handheld mode, you said docked mode, 1080p 30, right? That's the performance profile there. In handheld mode, it's not 30 FPS. It's actually closer to 40 FPS. It's hard to count exactly here, but it's in that kind of vicinity, I would think, of 40 FPS. And it's doing so at a resolution internally of about 720p in the shots I tested. So we know presumably they have the CPU overhead to pull off a 40 FPS gameplay experience. That would have been nice to see on Switch 2. Maybe in 120 Hz output. We are not seeing that here. So yeah, I think that's kind of an unfortunate state of affairs, and it really kind of shows like, hey, the Switch 2, it's powerful hardware, it can punch above its weight, seeing impressive things out of it all across the board. But if you do not leverage its unique features, you will not get a uniquely good experience. You're going to get something that scales in a way that's not too satisfactory necessarily on the Switch 2 hardware.